Shalom, shalom. It's Brother Yatazadak, hero of Israel. So 1 Corinthians chapter 7 breakdown. Giving all honor and glory to Yahweh B'Hashem Yahushai. Now, let's get right into it. It's 1 Corinthians chapter 7 verse 1. And it reads, Salakia. Now concerning the things whereof ye wrote unto me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman, because during this time, there was many tumults, many divisions going on during the time of the Romans and the Greeks, not just between the Jews that believe in Yahweh Shai Mashiach, but you also had these those that were under the influence of the elders and the rulers of the high positions, those that were over the people of the Jews, which was the Pharisees, and those to whom was given their position by the Romans. So you had a lot of division going on at this time, and a lot of bucking up against this sect, which was compromised throughout these various churches of Jews, practicing Jews and Israelite foreigners that were gathering together during this time, all under the belief of Yahweh Shai Mashiach. Now, verse 2 reads, Nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. Because even during this time, which is in the latter days, we have the same thing that was perpetrated during the time of the Romans and the Greeks, which was things like excessiveness, things like what you would call sport, which is a term for idolatry, and just a lot of perverseness that is being perpetrated today, which was during this time. So to avoid fornication, things like going to these Greekish gatherings, mainly the things like gymnasium, which was an act of those who were exercising to exercise naked, which was a one of the various Greekish customs and fashions, which is same thing being perpetrated in today's society. Now, that was to avoid these type of fornications. Every man to have his wife, because when the man has his wife and the wife has her husband, the time is being occupied besides into the praying and the fasting. You have your time being taken up by these things, to avoid things like fornication. And especially during the time of the Greeks and the Romans, they had these heathenish customs and fashions going on. Now it reads, Nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. Now, let's go to the first precept, book of Ephesians, chapter 5 and verse 22. It's book of Ephesians, chapter 5 and verse 22, and it reads, Wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands, as unto the Lord. So these were one of the reasons for a man to occupy if he was not to touch a woman if that was something that he was unable to refrain from. It was recommended by Paul to those at Corinth for a man to have his wife to avoid fornication. So Ephesians 5:22 says, "Wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands, as unto the Lord." Because the wife submitting to the husband and the husband being over the household, you have the marital relationship, which is taking up the time other than in the worship of Yahweh B'Shem Yahushai, praying, fasting, meditating on the scriptures. And this is why Paul recommended those at Corinth to avoid fornication, to let every man have his own wife, and remain where he is, and abide to where he is called. So this is what this chapter is mainly about, is pertaining to marriage. And if you were during this time, if you had a virgin who you were betrothed to, meaning you were this virgin you were planning to marry and have a marital relationship with, which included sexual relation. But during this time, which I have proved in the previous videos, this was a time when there was many tumults going on, tumults of the people, tumults of the within the Roman Empire, between Jews and Romans, which are Edomites, Idumeans of the nation of Edom. But the point here is that you had many tumults going on between the Jews and the Romans, and between the Jews and other Jews, which was the Jews who were practicing Jews, who were under the guide and direction of the rulers of the Jews, to whom their position was given by the Romans. And you also had them being over the people, the multitude of the Jews, and you had the Jews persecuting these Jews that believed in Yahushua Mashiach, that were gathering together in these various churches. So there was it's a time of tumults, and this is why in this chapter Paul is going into what is necessary during this time for men to do, whether they were called to avoid fornication, not to marry, and to do the work of the ministry, or to avoid fornication, and for the man to have his own wife and abide wherein he was called. Now let's go down to or actually that's it for this precept. Let's go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 2. And actually we'll go back to we'll move on to verse 3. And it reads, "Let the husband render unto the wife due benevolence, and likewise also the wife unto the husband." Verse 4, "The wife hath not power over her own body, but the husband, and likewise also the husband hath not power of his own body, but the wife." So again, this chapter isn't really too deep, and you have to have the understanding that certain things written in the epistles were actual instructions specifically to those individuals in these various congregations back then. Not all things can you read and apply to today and think that it is something that is speaking directly to you. Some things were actual accounts and directions pertaining to the time to whom these directions were written to, which in this chapter is to the congregation in the church at Corinth. Now let's bring out a precept in 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 1. Book of 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 1, and it reads, "This is a true saying, if a man desire the office of a bishop, he desireth a good work." Verse 2, "A bishop then must be blameless, the husband of one wife, vigilant, sober, of good behavior, given to hospitality, apt to teach." Now, the reason why I brought this precept out is, as you can see in verse 2, a bishop can have a wife, which is a head of a congregation, or a pastor, or like you have the term used in chapter 4 and verse 2, the term of a steward, which is those which were ministering to the several bodies during this time over these various congregations. Now, as you can see, it says in verse 2, for the husband to have a wife. Now, these bishops, they were able to have a wife, and so on and so forth. Or like it says in 1 Corinthians 7 and 1. Now, Paul is saying also it is good not to touch a woman. Now, you can also apply this today. Of course, it is profitable to have a wife, and it is commanded to be fruitful and multiply, which is that is part of the Thawarah, which is a Torah, and that's the precept in the book of Genesis. But that's more or less for another lesson. But the point here is that it is it is profitable to abstain from marriage in this current time. And the reason is, I'll go further into that reason as we read on. But it is also profitable, if you have a wife, that is also profitable today. And it is profitable to abstain from having a wife if you are to dedicate yourself to the work of the ministry for that edifying of the body in this current time. And this is also profitable to apply it to wherein you are called. Now, we understand these things were written as instructions back then, because what I'm going to read on in the latter verses is that Paul was explaining to the to this congregation that it was a dangerous time, and Paul had known and perceived that there was a destruction coming upon the land in 70 AD. Now, we know the same thing's happening today, which is the ICBM purification coming upon the land through the direction of the Heavenly Father, through the ICBM destruction. Now, we can use these instructions and apply them to today. But the point here is, as I read on, that Paul is warning these individuals in these various congregations, because you read a constant theme of at the current moment or current distress, certain things to abstain from. which is why Paul is saying in verse 1, 1 Corinthians 7:1, it's good for a man not to touch a woman. Now, this is the point that I'm going to bring out, is that Paul is explaining to this congregation and also in the various churches that the time is short. Now, we'll read that on in the latter verses, but first let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 14 and verse 34. And it reads, "Let your women keep silence in the churches, for it is not permitted unto them to speak, but they are commanded to be under obedience, as also saith the law." Now, that's according to the Torah, and the reason I brought out this precept is that Paul is citing the things contained in the law, which is proving my point that Paul, the things that he writes are he's merely expounding on the law. These things can't be used as actual doctrine, the things that Paul is saying, because you have an instance where he says in verse 10, chapter 7, he says, well, let's go to that precept. Now, 1 Corinthians 7 and verse 10. And it reads, "And unto the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord. Let not the wife depart from her husband." So he's saying, according to the law, the wife is not supposed to depart from her husband as long as he liveth. But if you go down to verse 12, he says, "But to the rest speak I, not the Lord." This is him merely giving his own personal opinion. So there are times when he's actually expounding on the precepts contained in the law and expounding on things that are lawful and it are instructed by the Heavenly Father, Yahweh B'Shem Yahushai. And there are instances where he is speaking on his own opinion and what is necessary for the current time. So these are things that you have to distinguish. And again, what Paul writes in the epistles, he is merely expounding on the law and applying his own commentary, like we do with these videos when we bring out precepts for edification. But these are not actual. This is not actual doctrine that Paul is teaching in the epistles, because you got to remember these were letters sent out to these various churches. Now you can expound on doctrine like we do when we do these videos, and Paul is expounding on doctrine, but you can't take what Paul is saying and automatically make it doctrine because he said it in the epistles. Because you have to remember, you got the measuring stick, which is the law and the prophets, and the things that Paul is writing is expounding on the law and the prophets. Now, let's go back to verse 4. And it reads, "The wife have not power of her own body, but the husband. And likewise also the husband hath not power of his own body, but the wife." Verse 5. "Defraud ye not one the other, except it be with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again, that Satan tempt you not for your incontinency." continency. Now, this is why Paul in verse 1, he's is saying that a man should not touch a woman, but if to avoid fornication, and like he said in verse 2, to let every man have his own wife, and every woman her own husband. Now, he was saying these things because there was the time was short for these various congregations to gather together. But as you can see in verse 5, that it is also profitable for a man to have his wife, and even today. But like he says in the latter verses, let every man abide wherein he is called. So you got brothers today, they may be out teaching, they might be doing videos. Everyone will ultimately remain and abide wherein they are called. Some may be getting built up and on doctrine, and so you can go out on highways and byways, but let every man abide wherein he is called. Some brothers that are in the truth, they have their families, they have their kids, their wives. But so this is also what Paul's saying to the church of Corinth during the time of the Romans and the Greeks, and it can be applied today. Now, let's read down to verse 6. So this chapter isn't really too deep. It's like I said, just speaking on marriage, pertaining to those who were to marry a virgin, and also going into the doing the work of the ministry, and to these Jews and practicing Jews and Israelite foreigners. He was instructing them, wherein you were called, therein you should abide. Now let's read down to verse 6. But I speak this by permission, and not of commandment. So again, there are times when he is speaking as a way for him to give his opinion or commentary on the things that were happening during his time. So you can't take everything that you read and apply it to today, or think that it applies to today. This is why there's a huge confusion on the things that the Apostle Paul writes, because you got certain individuals that will make whole doctrines out of the precepts of the epistles. So it reads, but I speak this by permission, and not of commandment. Verse 7, for I would that all men were even as I myself, but every man hath his proper gift of Yahweh, one after this manner, and another after that. Verse 8, I say therefore to the unmarried and widows, it is good for them if they abide even as I. Verse 9, but if they cannot contain, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn. So that's the whole point that I was bringing out, and starting with the first verse, is that there are certain things that Paul was writing to this church and telling them, let every man abide wherein they are called. Here in this section of this chapter, you have him going into those that were called back into the faith, the Israelite foreigners, and the practicing Jews that were gathering together in these various congregations, whether they were married or not, to abide wherein they were called. those that were not married, he is writing in verse 1, it is good not to touch a woman. For the reason is for them to continue in the work of the ministry, for the gathering together these various congregations, these two different groups, the practicing Jew and the Israelite foreigner. But also in verse 2, now he also is saying, to avoid fornication, for man to have his wife. But reading down to verse 7 on down, he's saying for each individual to remain wherein he was called. So these things are profitable even today. Now let's read to verse 10, because this, like I said, this chapter isn't too deep. It's just going on the pertaining to things like marriage and marriage vows. So verse 10, and it reads, and unto the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord, let not the wife depart from her husband. Now you have certain instances in the accounts that which is that a man should not let his wife depart from him. But you have the instance of the well, let me get that precept. It's Book of Judges, chapter 19 and verse 1. And it reads, and it came to pass in those days, when there was no king in Israel, that there was a certain Levite sojourning in the side of Mount Ephraim, who took to him a concubine out of Bethlehem, Judah. Now this is the Levite which took him a wife out of this town in Judah. Verse 2, and his concubine played the whore against him, and went away from him unto her father's house, to Bethlehem, Judah, and was there 4 whole months. Verse 3, and her husband arose and went after her to speak friendly unto her, and to bring her again, having a servant with him, and a couple of asses. And she brought him into her father's house, and when the father of the damsel saw him, he rejoiced to meet him. So this is why Paul is saying, the wife should not depart from her husband. And it is also a commanded in the Torah that the man is to be joined to his wife as soon as they have sexual relations. It's the Book of Genesis, chapter 2, and verse 24. And it reads, therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. Now you also have this in the law. Let's go to the book of Exodus, chapter 22, and verse 16. And if a man entice a maid that is not betrothed, meaning she is not promised to another individual, and lie with her, he shall surely endow her to be his wife. So that alone says that is implying that that the husband is not to depart from his wife as soon as they have sexual relations, which is what Paul is referencing here, 1 Corinthians 7 and 10. Now let's go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, and we'll move down to verse 11. And it reads, and if she depart, let her remain unmarried, or be reconciled to her husband. And let not the husband put away his wife. So this is also like I brought out in Judges chapter 19. The man went to reconcile the Levite with his concubine that he took out of the town of the daughters of Judah. Now, verse 12. Or actually, let's read verse 11 again. And if she depart, let her remain unmarried, or be reconciled to her husband. Because again, as long as the husband lives, that wife is still bound to her husband. So these are also things that this is why he said in chapter Salakia in verse 10, and to the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord, because these are out of the precepts of the law. Because if the wife were to depart from her husband, she was to remain unmarried, or to be reconciled with the husband. And the husband was not to put away his wife. Verse 12. But to the rest speak I, not the Lord. If any brother hath a wife that believeth not, and she be pleased to dwell with him, let him not put her away. So this is Paul giving his own opinion and his commentary, which was directed to these individuals in the Church of Corinth. This is why you can't take everything that Paul says and make a doctrine out of it, which is what most people will do today. They'll take one verse, one precept, and try to include these other nations, when it never spoke. The law never spoke about the other nations. It spoke on the children of Israel, which is so-called Black, Hispanic, Native Americans today. Now, verse 13. And the woman which hath a husband. Or actually, verse 12. But to the rest speak I, not the Lord. If any brother hath a wife that believeth not, and she be pleased to dwell with him, let him not put her away. So Paul said he speaks and not the Most High, which is what the law is commanding, which is what he referenced in chapter 10, Salakia verse 10. But here he's saying that he's speaking on his own behalf. Here in verse 12. So it reads, if any brother had a wife that believed not, and she be pleased to dwell with him, let him not put her away, because there was things that were profitable during the time of the Romans and the Greeks. And these are actual instructions to those back then. Now you have some people today that will take these verses 12 and on down, and say that if you come from another nation and you're enjoined onto a so-called Black, Hispanic, Native American, which are Israelites, that they're sanctified by the believing husband, and vice versa, and somehow they're grafted in. But that's nonsense. Now, because as you can see in verse 12, Paul is making a separation from what he said in verse 10. Verse 12, he's saying, I speak, and not the Lord. Now, because you had certain individuals that he is referencing in verse 12, You know, if that individual has a wife that doesn't believe, because you got to remember you had Israelite foreigners coming out of these heathenish customs and ways. So the only thing we can assume here is that these Israelite foreigners that were returning to their former customs and covenants, it's more than likely that their wives that they were joined unto, whether they were of these Israelite foreigners that were coming back into the fold, you had certain individuals that Paul's implying here in verse 12 that their wives most likely did not believe on the same thing that these Israelite foreigners that were returning back to the former covenants and customs and keeping the law, all under the belief of Yahushua Mashiach, in calling the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So you had these Israelite foreigners coming back into the fold, and some of their wives, which they did not believe, and this is referencing Israelite wives. This isn't referencing the other nations, because you'll see Paul, he's going to explain what he means in the following verse. So he's saying in verse 12, if a brother has a wife and she doesn't believe, let him not put her away, because again, she is still an Israelite. And these individuals that were Israelite foreigners that were returning, you know, they still had to keep the law, whether their wives believed or not, because at the end of the day, the man was the head of the household. Whether the wife believed or not, during this time when there were Israelite foreigners returning back to the former covenants and customs, and what Paul's referencing here, the wives that did not believe, at the end of the day, the husband was the head of the household and was over the children, if there were children in this certain household, which he isn't referencing a certain household. He's speaking, like he said, he's speaking on his own behalf. But he is referencing those Israelite foreigners who were coming back into the fold and had wives that did not believe, and telling them not to put them away. Because at the end of the day, the husband was over the household. The husband was going to teach the children to keep the law regardless, because it is what was commanded in the precepts of the Torah. Verse 13, and the woman which hath a husband that believeth not, and if he be pleased to dwell with her, let her not leave him. So vice versa, you had these Israelite foreigners, you know, these women which their fathers were Israelites. This isn't talking about those of other nations, because you're going to see Paul expounds on what he's saying out of his own behalf and pertaining to the things that were happening during this time. So you can't take this and apply it and make a doctrine out of it and say it's talking about the other nations, and they're sanctified because they are either a Israelite man with one of a woman of the other nations, or an Israelite woman with a man of the other nations, and they are sanctified because of the man because of the woman. But that's not what it's talking about, and you'll see he's going to explain it in the following verse. So it reads, verse 13, and the woman which hath an husband that believeth not, and if he be pleased to dwell with her, let her not leave him. So you had these Israelite foreigners, which were also consisted of daughters of Israelite men. So these women were leaving these heathenish customs in these various congregations where the Jews and these Israelite foreigners were gathering together. And they also, Paul is speaking on his behalf, but he's speaking on the things that he saw and experienced during this time. So he's referencing women that had husbands that did not believe. But if these women who were claiming to keep the law and returning to former covenants and customs, they were still under the commandment of the precepts of the law, which, like I read in Genesis 2:24, the wife shall cleave to her husband, and the husband to his wife, and they shall be one flesh. So although Paul is speaking on his behalf, he is speaking on things that also are pertain to the law. If you can separate the two things that he's referencing, because he's referencing actual things that were going on during his time, and lining them up with the law. So these Israelite foreigners, which were women, returning back into the fold, were keeping the law, but they had these their husbands, which were also Israelite foreigners, that did not believe. But according to the law, they were still not to depart from their husband. Verse 14. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Else were your children unclean, but now they are holy. Because at the end of the day, whether, like it says here in verse 14, the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife. Why? Because the wife was keeping the law, keeping the commandments, and ultimately was able to teach the children in some form or fashion. Because you got to remember, the wife is around the children most of the time. The wife is the caregiver, and the husband is the provider, or the one that does the strenuous work. And the wife plays the administrator. And here, in this instance, is the administration of the bringing up the children and teaching children. So this unbelieving husband was still sanctified by the wife, because the children will still be able to be taught through the wife, through the caregiver. And verse 13, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Why? Because even in this instance, the husband is still over the head of the household. Whether the wife believed or not, the husband was still the head over the wife, whether she believed or not, and the children, which the children ultimately were to obey the father, because the father was the head of the household. Now, this is why it says, else were your children unclean, but now they are holy. Because either way, whether the father believed or the mother believed, they were sanctified, because they were still keeping the commandments and will still return to former covenants and customs. And the children were still to be able to be taught in one form or fashion or another. This is how you know it's not speaking of those of the other nations, because you have to line this up with the things that were happening during this time. And you can't take these things and make a doctrine out of it and apply it to today, because these are actual accounts of things that were happening during this time. This is why Paul says in verse 12, I speak and not the Lord, because he was referencing actual accounts and things that were happening, transpiring in these various congregations. When these practicing Jews were gathering together with these Israelite foreigners in these various congregations under the belief of Yahushua Mashiach. Verse 15. But if the unbelieving depart, let him depart. A brother or a sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God hath called us to peace. So again, this is in this precept, this is also referencing what was going on during this time. So you can actually take this and apply it to today, because there's a lot of wickedness going on in these days too, and a lot of these women are unclean and broken in, or like they say, well, I'm speaking on my behalf, on my own behalf, that and things that I have experienced, and but I'm not saying that all women are like that today. I'm just speaking on my behalf, the things that I have seen and experienced regarding the daughters of Sarah. But they're righteous females also, but they come a dime a dozen, just like the men, because a lot of the men even were caught up in a lot of folly today. Those that are mainly those that are in the world and not in truth. Verse 15. But if the unbelieving depart, let him depart. A brother or a sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God hath called us to peace. Verse 16. For what knowest thou, O wife, whether thou shalt save thy husband? Or how knowest thou, O man, whether thou shalt save thy wife? And that's true today. Whether you're in the truth, you're already married, and you were married before you came in the truth. You had children. You don't know if you're able to save your wife, or the wife able to save her husband if she is in the truth, and in the latter days, in these days, and she has a wife, and Salakia, she has a husband and children, and she had them before coming into the truth, because ultimately that's up to the Heavenly Father. But this is first and foremost Paul referencing things that were going on back then. So some things you can take and apply today, but some things are actual directions and instructions to those back then, like I read in the previous verses. Verse 17. But as God had distributed to every man, as the Lord hath called every one, so let him walk, and so ordain I in all churches. So again, certain things were certain instructions that pertain to this time. So you can't take everything Paul is saying and make a doctrine out of it. You have to distinguish what is pertaining to things that he expounds on according to the law, and things that he was giving his own opinion on regarding things that were going on during this time. Now let's go to verse 18. Is any man called being circumcised? Let him not become uncircumcised. Is any called in uncircumcision? Let him not be circumcised. Verse 19. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing, but keeping the commandments of Yahweh. So again, the point here is that those that were called, which were these practicing Jews, they were called into these various congregations, and the terminology that Paul is using is those that were called being circumcised, being in the circumcision, which is in the knowledge of the law and the prophets already, and on already keeping the law, keeping the commandments, keeping the customs. And it reads, let him not become uncircumcised, because these practicing Jews that were returning and gathering together with these Israelite foreigners in these various congregations, they were not to to go backwards on the things that they were already doing, as far as keeping the commandments and keeping the precepts of the law. And it reads, is any called in uncircumcision, let him not be circumcised. Because there were those that were called in uncircumcision, which uncircumcision is the term for these Israelite foreigners, which they were returning back to their former covenants and customs, which were gathering together in these various churches. So he's saying, let him not be circumcised, meaning, let him not immediately just be circumcised, and actually just keeping the law or keeping the letter of the law, which is what these the ruler of the Jews were perpetrating. So not to actually, Paul is saying not to actually, if these Israelite foreigners, those that were called in uncircumcision, meaning they weren't keeping the laws, Paul is saying let him not be circumcised, meaning, don't just circumcise yourself and just keep the letter of the law like these like the rulers of the Jews were doing, because they were claiming to keep the law, circumcising, offering up their sacrifices. The letter of the law, that is the letter of the law, the carnal washings, which is and things pertaining to that, as far as purification and but Paul is saying that, and those are things that pertain to the letter of the law. So Paul is saying, don't just keep the don't just, if you were called, returning back into the fold, don't just automatically do what these rulers of the Jews were doing, which were just offering up the sacrifices, fasting, giving alms in front of men to be seen of men, and denying things like, having mercy on your people, and also, rebuking your own people, correcting them, and things that the whole purpose of the law, which is justice, mercy, and not just keeping the carnal things of the law, like offering up sacrifice, when you're doing the opposite, because the sacrifices were a way for atonement or to cover sins. But the rulers of the Jews, as they were offering up these sacrifices for covering of their sins, they were at the same time sinning against these Israelite foreigners, because they were excluding them, and they were excluding anybody who did not agree with their ways. So Paul is saying, if you're called in uncircumcision, just don't become circumcised and do it exactly like these like the rulers of the Jews were doing, which they were saying to keep the law, but they weren't keeping the law. They were hypocrites. So that's the whole point. Paul's not saying, don't become circumcised. He's just saying to these Israelite foreigners, if you were called in uncircumcision and returning back into the fold, get built up the right way. Don't just, return back to your customs and just circumcise your flesh and just start offering up sacrifices and when that's what the rulers of the Jews were doing, and they were still being hypocrites because they were denying these Israelite foreigners, and they were denying the important things of the law, which was justice, which was loving your own people, showing mercy, and and so on and so forth. So it reads, verse 19, circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing, because there were Jews that were called the circumcision, claimed to keep the law, but that the law, it was worthless and it was pointless, because they were excluding these Israelite foreigners, and they were doing things contrary to the law, like with their Corban tradition, which if a man had a sacrifice which was consecrated for the altar, and instead of honoring his mother and his father, what he was commanded to do was say it is Corban, meaning it was consecrated gift, and I cannot help you with it. So these were priests, these were the rulers of the Jews. They were with their traditions, they were going against the law and being hypocrites. So this is why Paul's saying circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing, meaning these Israelite foreigners that were coming back into the fold. And Paul's making a point here. He's saying keeping the letter of the law is nothing, and those that were uncircumcised, that's not important either. Meaning those that are coming back into the fold, they're not circumcised, but they want to keep the law. The point is that Paul is saying is that they got to get built up the right way before just cutting their own flesh and just start keeping the law to a T. Because that wasn't the whole purpose of the law, was to keep order within the nation and to do the things that were that is the whole point of the law, like helping your own people, loving your own people, justice, mercy, and which is the whole point, and that is the whole point of keeping the commandments. Is why Yahushua Mashiach said the greatest commandment is to love your neighbor as yourself, because if you're keeping that, then you're keeping the majority of the precepts. But that is not what the rulers of the Jews were doing. So it reads, verse 19, circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing, but keeping the commandments of Yahweh. So the point is that the whole point Paul is making is that you got to keep in mind he's writing to two different groups, these letters, to Jews, practicing Jews, and Israelite foreigners in these congregations. So he's saying, circumcision is nothing, because the Jews, they were claiming to keep the law, but they weren't keeping the whole point of the law, but they were keeping the letter of the law. And uncircumcision is nothing, because these Israelite foreigners, they weren't built up in as they were returning to their former covenants and customs. So their uncircumcision was nothing, and but to keep the commandments, which is the whole point that Paul is making here. This is why he said in verse 18, is any called uncircumcision, let him not be circumcised, because before he was to do that, he was to be built up in the correct way, not just keeping the law to a T, or the letter of the law, like these rulers of the Jews were doing. Now let's go to this precept, 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 37. 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 37, and it reads, if any man think himself to be a prophet or spiritual, let him acknowledge that the things that I write unto you are the commandments of the Lord. So this is the point that Paul is also making here in chapter 7:19, Slakia. Is it the whole point is to keep the commandments, and he tells you what the commandments are. He expounds on the commandments, but there are times when he's giving his opinion on the things that were happening during this time, which is why he says in chapter 7 verse 18, is any man called being circumcised, let him not be uncircumcised. So it doesn't make sense if you're taking this literally, or you think, Paul is teaching contrary to the law. He's not teaching contrary to the law. He's using what I referenced in the previous video. He's using a hyperbole, which is an exaggeration, or he's saying these things to make a point. So it's impossible for someone who came into the truth, or who was coming into the knowledge of the truth during this time, of that they were Israelites returning back to their covenants and customs, or even a Jew that was already keeping the law, that were called being circumcised, to uncircumcise themselves. So that's not physically possible. So you have to make the analogy that Paul is saying these things as to make a point and pertaining to things that were happening during this time. This is why you have to know the chain of events and how things went down, and piece together the accounts and the Acts and the accounts given by Matthew, Luke, John, Mark. And you have to piece together all these things and the things that Yahushua Mashiach taught. And this is how you get the proper doctrine and you get the proper understanding. You can't take what Paul says and make a doctrine out of it, or say, well, I don't have to be circumcised, because he said that in verse 18. But in verse 19, Paul is saying, keep the commandments. And like I read in 1 Corinthians 14:37. Verse 20. And it reads, let every man abide in the same calling wherein he was called. Because there was Jews who were returning back, gathering with these Israelite foreigners, and they were already keeping the law, but they were keeping it, the letter of the law, like these the rulers of the Jews were teaching them, which was just to offer sacrifice, carnal washings, to purify themselves. For example, you to wash, wait till sundown, and then you'll be clean. And things like offering up sacrifice for covering of sins, but they were sinning at the same time. And they were given a mercy by the Most High to offer up these sacrifices to cover for their sins. But which was a form of mercy that the law gave to these Jews. But the Jews were denying that same mercy to these Israelite foreigners. So this is why Paul said, to let every man abide in the same calling wherein he was called. Because there was Jews that were coming in. They knew the letter of the law, they knew the precepts, and they were already circumcised, but they had to be built up in keeping the correct execution of the law, which is the important things like mercy, judgment, and loving your own people, which is what they were doing and gathering with these Israelite foreigners under the belief that Yahushua Mashiach in his ministry had called these Israelite foreigners back into the fold. So that was the difference between the things that they were doing in these congregations and the things that the rulers of the Jews were perpetrating. This is why Paul said in verse 18, is any man being called being circumcised, let him not become uncircumcised. Meaning he still has to keep the law. And is any being called in uncircumcision, like it says in verse 18, let him not be circumcised. So these Israelite foreigners that were called coming back into the fold were considered uncircumcision. So the point here, Paul is saying, let him not be circumcised, meaning these Israelite foreigners coming back into the fold, don't just get circumcised. Don't just start keeping the letter of the law, but you're going to be doing the same hypocrisy that these the rulers of the Jews were teaching the multitude of the practicing Jews. And he said in verse 19 to keeping the commandments is the important thing, meaning these Israelite foreigners that were coming back into the fold, they had to get built up the right way, in first knowing the knowledge of the law and the prophets, and then keeping it correctly according to what Yahushua Mashiach taught. Now, let's go to the precept, book of Galatians, chapter 2 and verse 4. It's book of Galatians, chapter 2 and verse 4, and it reads, and that because of false brethren unawares brought in, who came in privily to spy out our liberty, which we have in Mashiach Yahushai, that they might bring us into bondage. So this is why Paul said, let every man abide wherein he was called. Now, because you had these proselytizers, which were brought up under the guidance of the rulers of the Jews, who were approaching these Israelite foreigners after they had become aware that Yahushua Mashiach had called these Israelite foreigners back into the fold. So they were immediately approaching them, commanding them to circumcise themselves and their children, and to keep, the precepts of the law, but they weren't building them up in the correct manner. But they would just have them circumcise themselves to claim them as converts. And, just have them offer up sacrifices to the temple, or go to the to do things like the carnal washings, but they weren't building them up the right way, and were ultimately pulling them out of these congregations and bringing them into the same bondage that the rulers of the Jews had them in. And that bondage, part of it was these traditions that the rulers of the Jews were perpetrating. And they were doing the exact opposite as far as administering justice and showing mercy and loving their own people. And their traditions were contrary to the law. Now, let's go back to 1 Corinthians 7:21. 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 21. Art thou called, being a servant? Care not for it, but if thou mayest be made free, use it rather. Because there was Jews under the servitude of their people, which is something you can do in the law. So there was practicing Jews that were in servitude to their own people, but they weren't slaves, but they were merely serving and being guided under them, under those that they were under their household. But you also had these Israelite foreigners who were under servitude, meaning actual slavery or bondage under the Romans, and some were not, considered free men. But the point here is that Paul is saying what is profitable is actually to do the work of the ministry. Don't care for the things of being a servant. Whether you were an Israelite foreigner and we were under the Romans, or you were a practicing Jew and you were under another one of the practicing Jews under their household as a servant. But he's saying, to use it, if you can be free, use it rather. Meaning, if you were able to gain your freedom from these engagements that you were, or obligations, to use the occasion if you are able to gain your freedom for the ministry, so you can do the ministering to these Israelite foreigners that were called in back into the fold during this time. This book of Acts, chapter 22 and verse 28. And it reads, "And the chief captain answered, With a great sum obtained I this freedom. And Paul said, But I was born free." So Paul was the son of a Pharisee of the tribe of Benjamin. He was born free under his own people. And this the captain, which is I believe Salakia. Let me see if I can get the Salakia. I'll save that for another lesson. But the point here is the chief captain. He had told Paul with a great sum he obtained his freedom, meaning this man, he was able to buy his freedom because there were people under bondage, under actual slavery during the times of the Romans and the Greeks, and that's the whole point of me bringing out the precept. Acts 22 verse 28. Now let's go back to 1 Corinthians 7 and 22. "For he that is called in the Lord, being a servant, is the Lord's free man. Likewise also he that is called, being free, is Hamashiach's servant." So that just explains what was happening during this time. So again, there's actual commentary that Paul is referencing pertaining to things that were actually happening during this time. And there were things that Paul is expounding on the law pertaining to doctrine. So you have to separate the two. And you have to separate the things that are applicable to today, and there are things that are not applicable to today. Verse 23. "Ye are bought with a price. Be not ye the servants of men." Because ultimately, according to the law, or actually, let me get that precept first. It's Leviticus chapter 26 and verse 13. So the law states that children of Israel are not to be bondmen, but to serve the Most High, Yahweh Bashim Yahushua. And this book of Leviticus chapter 26 and verse 13. Because they were brought out of the land of bondage. And when the law was instituted, they were to serve the Most High according to the precepts and believing and in the faith. Book of Leviticus chapter 26 and verse 13. "I am the Lord your God, which brought you forth out of the land of Egypt, that ye should not be their bondmen. which is the Egyptians. And I have broken the bands of your yoke and made you go upright, because ultimately that's what is going to break the bands of the yoke, which is keeping the law. And the whole reason why the nation of Israel, so-called Black, Hispanic, Native Americans, were cursed was because they were not keeping the law and were doing things contrary to the law, like committing idolatry, spiritual fornication, worshiping of other gods, fearing other gods, when the law says you're only to fear Yahweh Hashem Yahushai. Now, that was the reason for for the law to be instituted, to for there to be order within the nation, and also for the reverencing of the Most High. So that was the whole reason for the law, and which is why the law was instituted in the first place, for 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 to show the nation of Israel after they had left Egypt the proper ways of serving the Most High, which was not instituted during the until after they left Egypt, because there was practices going on that the Israelites were accustomed to in Egypt. You know, things like worshiping animals, which is why in the book of Exodus, when Moses went up to the mount, you know, the Israelites, along with Aaron, they had made a golden calf, because that is was a custom of the Egyptians, which is the worshiping of animals, and that's ultimately what these other nations do. You know, worshiping, you know, animals, the stars, and the host of heaven, the multitudes of the constellations, and this is why it says in verse 13, you know, it says, I have broken the bands of your yoke. And because the whole point after the Israelites left Egypt was that they were given certain laws and certain precepts that commanded not to follow the ways of these other nations, or to follow after their gods, and specifically to follow Yahweh Bashim Yahushai. And that is ultimately was going to break the bands of the yoke, which is keeping the law, because the whole point of the curses was for those who did not keep the precepts of the law, because under the covenant and the oath that the forefathers had agreed to, and had binded themselves and their future generations unto this this covenant, which was under the consequence that if the law was not to be kept, and if you were to do the things that were contrary to what the Most High commanded, that there would be retribution for those things. Now, vice versa, in keeping the law, there are things that when the law was to be kept in a true manner, not just, like I said, the letter of the law, and doing the carnal washings, when you were to do the things that the Most High delights in, which is righteousness, justice, and mercy, which is the whole point of the law, loving your own people, you know, having an order, having within the nation, and not following the ways of these other nations, like it says in Leviticus chapter 18. Do not do after the lands of Canaan and the people, because the abominations that they did is the reason why they were their land was given to Yasharallah. Now that is going into breaking the bands of your yoke, which is referenced in Leviticus 26 and 13, and made you go upright, because the Most High Yahweh Bashim Yahushai is ultimately saying, like in verse 14, but if you will not hearken unto me and not do all these commandments, and if ye shall despise my statutes, and your soul abhor my judgments, so that ye will not do all my commandments, but that ye break my covenant, also I will do this unto you. So these are the effects of not following the whole point of the law, which is not to follow after the ways of these other nations, and not just the land of Canaan, but the whole point is the customs that the Israelites came out of Egypt that they were accustomed to doing, which includes but is not limited to things like worshiping of animals and so on and so forth. And this is the whole point of 1 Corinthians. Now let's go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 23. Salakia. Ye are bought with a price, be not ye the servants of men. So ultimately, the point of bringing the precept in Leviticus 26 and 13 is that Paul's saying is the point is you got to serve the Most High according to what the forefathers had binded themselves to follow pertaining to the law, and the law was commanded and instituted for a reason, also for there to be order within the nation and not to follow the ways of the nations around you, like it says in the law. So this is why Paul's saying, "Be not servants of men," because ultimately, he said you were bought with a price, and he's speaking to those descendants of those that came, the Israelites that came out of Egypt. They were bought with a price. They were called out of these the ways of Egypt, and the law was instituted for them to serve the Most High and not to be the servants of men. And ultimately, the law, the spirit of the law, is righteousness, truth, judgment, mercy, and that is what ultimately what breaks the bands of the yoke and makes you go upright. Because when you're under your yoke, you're under the yoke of this world, and also what these other nations perpetrate, which is ultimately vanity, and is contrary to to what the Most High has commanded the forefathers and these generations that in the latter days of the forefathers of the Israelites. Now let's go to verse 25, and it reads. So actually, so the whole point here is verses 1 through 24 was going into marriage and going into those that were coming into the fold, and they were, like it says in verse 18, they came in knowing the law, knowing they had to keep the law, keep the commandments, and they were practicing their customs. And those that came unto these various congregations who were coming out of these heathenish ways, and they were commanded not to immediately circumcise themselves, but they had to be built up in the correct manner, just like those who had came in circumcised, being meaning they were already keeping the law, but they were keeping it according to the hypocrisy that the rulers of the Jews taught them, along with their traditions, which were added to also what the law to the which they were adding to as far as what was commanded in the law. They were also adding these traditions, while they were coming in circumcised. So this is why Paul said in verse 19, circumcision is nothing, and circumcision is nothing but keeping the commandments. So these practicing Jews, they were coming into the fold, but they had to be built up in the correct way, which was keeping the execution of the law in the correct manner, which is what Yahweh Shai Mashiach taught in his ministry. So this is what it's talking about, verse 18 and on down. And this is why he said in verse 20, let every man abide in the calling wherein he was called. And also goes into the into those that were under bondage during this time. But verse 25, now he's going into the also going into those that were well, let's just read on. You know, this is also going into marriage and going back to the previous topic that Paul was writing about. Verse 25, 1 Corinthians 7:25. Now concerning virgins, I have no commandment of the Lord. Yet I give my judgment as one that have obtained mercy of the Lord to be faithful. Verse 26. I suppose therefore that this is good for the present distress. I say that it is good for a man so to be. Like he said in verse 7. Now for time's sake, let's just read it real quick and then we'll move on. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 7. For I would that all men were even as myself, but every man hath his proper gift of the Most High, one after this manner, and another after that. So, you know, this is also what he's speaking on pertaining to verse 18. Because there were some that were called, you know, being practicing Jews, already keeping the law, but they had to be built up in the correct manner, as well as these Israelite foreigners coming back into the fold, because they had to first be built up in the knowledge of the law and the prophets, and then also to keep the law in the proper way, which is the way Yahweh Shai Mashiach taught. And the whole purpose of the law was to have order within a nation, to build up your own people, which is what these Jews and Israelite foreigners were doing, which is why they were despised by some of their own people, some of the Jews, because the Jews that were coming up against these various churches, they were those were them that were under the rulers of the Jews, which they were ultimately perpetrating the same hypocrisy that these Jews were doing, and they were just following the letter of the law and not the spirit of the law. And the spirit of the law, like I said, is having order within a nation, building up your own people, and edifying your own people. But the Jews and those that were under them, the rulers of the multitudes, those who were not in these various congregations, they were just commanding these Israelite foreigners just to circumcise themselves and automatically just keep the law to a T without building them up in the way that Paul was doing to these various congregations. So chapter 7 and verse 1, he's going into those who were called, whether they were married or unmarried. And then verse 18, those that were called, whether they were already keeping the law and had to be built up in the correct way, those who were called who had no knowledge of keeping the law but had to be built up in the correct way before actually circumcising themselves and just keeping the law to a T. So that's the whole point of verse 18 and on down. But now, like Paul said in verse 25, you know, he did not have a wife, but he dedicated his time to the edifying of the nation, for the work of the ministry, for the perfecting of the saints, like he says in the book of Galatians. But the whole point is that chapter, in the beginning of the chapter, he's speaking on those that were called, whether they were married or not, and what each individual should do pertaining to verse 10 and on down, what is lawful and what is expedient for those that had wives that did not believe but were returning back into the fold, and whether there was an Israelite foreigner which had a wife that did not believe, or an Israelite foreigner which had a husband, and her husband did not believe, but she believed in returning and keeping the commandments. So these are the instructions that Paul was given. And in verse 18 on down, those who were called being circumcised, meaning they were already keeping the law, had to be built up the right way. And these Israelite foreigners that were coming back into these various congregations and had to be built up. Verse 26. I suppose, therefore, that this is good for the present distress. I say it is good for a man so to be. Verse 27. Art thou bound unto a wife? Seek not to be loosed. Art thou loosed from a wife? Seek not a wife. Verse 28. And if thou marry, thou hast not sinned. And if a virgin marry, she had not sinned. Nevertheless, such shall have trouble in the flesh, but I spare you. Now, this is why, like I said, he started off the chapter mainly in verse 2, to avoid fornication, for every man have his wife, and every woman her own husband. And if you go down in verse 10, he is saying what the order is for those who had wives that did not believe, or wives that had husbands that did not believe, that were returning back into the fold and believed in keeping the commandments, but their counterparts did not. So what was profitable is for them to remain with them if they were married already, so that the children can be built up through one spouse or the other. Now, let's read on in let's read verse 27 again. Art thou bound unto a wife? Seek not to be loosed. Because he said in verse 10, that the whole purpose is whether your husband believes or not, or you're a Israelite woman and you have a husband that does not believe, it's profitable to stay with your spouse because of the children, to build up the children so that they may be brought up in the commandments, whether it is through the father or through the mother. Now, seek not to be loosed. Art thou loosed from a wife? Seek not a wife, because there were those who had their wives, and they their wives either had left them, or their wives were deceased, and they just didn't have a wife because of that. And Paul's saying to not seek a wife because there was a lot of work to be done during that time, and even today. But the point here is that for the ministering to these various churches and the individuals that were in these various churches, it was profitable not to seek a wife during that time. Now, even today, but there are those, it's good to be married even today, to have children, so you can build up the children, but let every man remain wherein he is called. Now, verse 28. And if thou marry, thou hast not sinned. So Paul's saying if you marry, you're not sinning, because you have to be fruitful and multiply as pertaining to the law. And that's what Paul said to Noah and the sons of Noah after they had left the ark. And that is part of the law. to be fruitful and multiply. And let's read on. And it says, and if a virgin marry, she had not sinned. So again, the whole point is the law states to be fruitful and multiply. And it reads, nevertheless, such shall have trouble in the flesh, but I spare you. Verse 29, but this I say, brethren, the time is short. It remaineth both they that have wives be as though they had none. Because the time was short, like I said in the beginning of the video, there was destruction coming to the land. And this is a constant theme that you read of, not just in this epistle, but in the various epistles that Paul is writing. Now, an example would be chapter 3 and verse 15. This 1 Corinthians, chapter 3 and verse 15. And it reads, if any man's work shall be burnt, he shall suffer loss, but he himself shall be saved, yet so as by fire. Because you had that fire coming into that land, which was a destruction 70 AD in the siege. And this even applies to today. So it's profitable to have your family and to build up a household, but all things are lawful, but all things are not expedient, because there's work to be done, and let every man abide wherein Yahweh Bashim Yahushai called him into. Now, it says, Salakia. Verse 15, if any man's work shall be burnt, he shall suffer loss, but he himself shall be saved, yet so as by fire. Because starting from verse 13, Paul was mentioning that there was the time was short, and there was the work of those that were doing the ministry and the work of the ministry. Some of that work would be lost and will be burnt up. But ultimately, according to the lot, Yahweh Bashim Yahushai that appointed them to, they will be saved if that is what the Lord willed. Now, also let's go to chapter 4 and verse 14. I write not these things to shame you, but as my beloved sons, I warn you. Now, this was a constant theme. He was giving them that righteous admonition, not just to those at the Church of Corinth, but to these various congregations. This is why he's giving these certain instructions, because it was expedient, to abide wherein they were called, whoever each individual was called into, and because that time was short, like he says in chapter 7 verse 29. And also you see that theme, Salaki, let me see if I can get that preset, just to establish the matter, Salaki. See if I can find this precept. I believe it's in verse 2 in the latter verse. So let me see if I can get that precept. This is Romans chapter 3 and verse 8, and it reads, and now rather as we be slanderously reported, And as some affirm that we say, let us do evil that good may come, whose damnation is just. Because you had, this is Paul referencing the rulers of the Jews, that they were doing, perpetrating hypocrisy through their traditions. So they were doing evil, that good may come unto them. And that was what their mindset was, because they were teaching the law, but they were doing things contrary to the law with their traditions. So they were doing evil, and expecting good things to come out of that, just because they were set up by the Romans as the teachers of the Jews, and because they were keeping the law and they were teaching to keep the law. But ultimately, that was in vain, because they were perpetrating hypocrisy. Now it says that whose damnation is just, because there was even in the beginning of John's ministry, he had told the Pharisees, you generation of vipers, who have warned you of the destruction to come. So this is that same theme that Paul uses within the various epistles. A certain warning, a certain tone of time being short, of things that had to be done and things that had to come to pass. So let's go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 29. And it reads, But this I say, brethren, the time is short. It remaineth that both they that have wives be as though they had none. So Paul was saying the time is short, because there was a destruction coming upon the land. This is why he was saying it was important to abide wherein each individual was called, whether in uncircumcision, whether in circumcision, whether they were already keeping the law, whether they had to be built up in keeping the law, whether, like he said in the beginning of the chapter, whether you weren't married, seek not a wife, because there was work to be done, and whether you had a wife, to remain as you are, but to dedicate your time to the ministry. And also, like you said in verse 10, those that have husbands that believe, and the husbands that had wives that did not believe, to stay together for the sake of building up the children, and also not just because it was commanded in the law, but also so that they may show their righteous works to their counterpart, during this time, in the ways of them keeping the law. So these were instructions that Paul was giving, because there was a short time frame of the things that they had to do as far as the ministering to these various congregations. Paul was saying, you have a wife that doesn't believe, leave her not, and a husband that doesn't believe, leave him not, because ultimately it's profitable for the children, for the building up of the children, and ultimately, because it's part of the law, and to remain where you're called, because through your works you can gainsay, or you can salakia, you can convince your spouse. So these are instructions and that Paul was giving in this chapter. And some things are actual instructions that pertain to that time. And like you said, the time is short, because there was destruction coming to the land. Now, we can take this today, because there is a destruction coming upon the land, and the time is short. So it is profitable to marry, but if you're called in being a minister, or whatever the case may be, whether you're out there teaching, you're getting built up, you're getting the breakdowns, or you're just making exhortation videos, whatever the case may be, to abide wherein you're called for the edifying of the nation of Israel. Now, Let's read on in verse 30. And they that weep as though they wept not, and they that rejoice as though they rejoice not, and they that use this world as not abusing it, for the fashion of this world passeth away. And that applies to today also, and even back then, because there was a destruction coming upon land, and even today, there was a tumults going on back then within the people, and even today. So, to use the world and not abuse the fashion of the world, and that is even something that Paul referenced in chapter 4 and verse 2, and that is part of being a faithful steward, as a well, let's read verse 1, 1 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 1. Let a man so account of us as of the ministers of Hamashiach, and stewards of the mysteries of the Most High Yahweh. Verse 2, moreover, it is required in stewards that a man be found faithful. So that's part of being a faithful steward, to abide wherein you are called, and because the fashion of this world is really temporal, and like Yahweh Shai said in Luke chapter 16, that one that is faithful, is least is also faithful in much, and he that is unfaithful in least is also unfaithful in much. So you gotta abide wherein you're called, and be a faithful steward wherein you're called, and the Most High will guide your steps. Now let's go back to chapter 7 and verse 30. So we'll read verse 30 again. And they that weep as though they wept not, and they that rejoice as though they rejoice not, and they that buy as they possess not, and they that use this world as not abusing it, for the fashion of this world passeth away. And this is also going into what Yahweh Shai taught in the parable of the rich man and the steward, because you had him say that you cannot serve God and money, so you have to be a faithful steward and use of the world, of the unrighteous mammon, to do the work of the ministry, whether you're called, being a faithful steward, or you're called in building up a household, whatever the case may be. Now because it says in verse 31, and they that use this world is not abusing it, for the fashion of this world passeth away. And those are the temporal things of the world. This is why the whole parable of Luke chapter 16 was to abide wherein you were called, and to not sway to and fro, because you can't serve God and money. You can't have two masters. You have to serve, wherein you were called, whether it is the ways of this world or Yahweh Bashim Yahushai. Now, verse 32, but I would have you without carefulness. He that is unmarried careth for the things that belong to the Lord, how he may please the Lord. And that's going into those that are married, and have dedicated their time to the work of the ministry to these various congregations. Whether, like he said in verse 18, if one is Salakia called in circumcision, let him not be uncircumcised, but to build himself up, so he can build up the rest of these of the congregation. And he that is called in uncircumcision, to build himself up in the law, so he be built up the other Israelite foreigners that were coming into the fold. So that is going to things that please the Lord. Because during this time, you had to have those that were not just the bishops, but those that were also that were teaching and edifying and building up their fellow believers within these congregations. Verse 33, and it reads, "But he that is married careth for the things that are of the world, how he may please his wife." Because again, you have some that are called in doing the work of the ministry, and some that are called in building up their household, which is ultimately building up the nation through their household. So this is why Paul says, "He that is married careth for the things of the world, that he may please his wife." Because part of the things of this world are your not just worldly possessions, but things that pertain to your worldly possessions, which is things like a household, and part of that household is your wife and your children. So, and that takes time away from the things that to wherein these Jews and these Israelite foreigners were dedicated, as far as those who weren't married, and they were dedicating their time to the ministry. Verse 34, there is a difference also between a wife and a virgin. The unmarried woman careth for the things of the Lord, that she may be holy both in body and in spirit. But she that is married careth for the things of the world, how she may please her husband. So Paul's making a distinction here, because there were those Jews and Israelite foreigners in these congregations that had wives that actually had already had sexual relations with their wives, and had children out of those relations. And there were those who had virgins, which they were espoused to marry these virgins in these various congregations. They were, like they would say today, engaged. So it says, the unmarried woman cared for the things of the Lord, because those that were with these Jews and Gentiles, these women that had not had these sexual relations, and Paul is saying, and those were the unmarried women, those who were espoused to a husband, but they hadn't had that sexual relation with them. So it says, the unmarried woman cared for the things of the Lord, that she may be holy both in body and spirit. But she that is married careth for the things of this world, how she may please her husband. Because there were those who had already had, whether they were Jews or Israelite foreigners, they already had sexual relations with their wife, and children out of those sexual relations that they had. And the married woman cared for the things of the world, because the things of the world were connected to the household, and the household was connected to the family that those that were in these congregations that they had. So they had to dedicate more of their time in building up their household instead of doing the ministry, which is the point that Paul is saying here. And verse 35, and this I speak for your own profit, not that I may cast a snare upon you, but for that which is comely, and that ye may attend upon the Lord without distraction. So this may be a stumbling block for those who aren't really too good on vernacular, if I have used the right terminology. So we're going to read into the various translation. And so we're gonna all take a look at the terminology here for vernacular. It reads: vernacular, the language or dialect spoken by the ordinary people in a particular country or region. So this was a vernacular that was used during this time of the Romans and the Greeks, which could be hard to understand for an individual today. So we're going to look at the various translations. Now we'll start here at 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 36. Actually, I was supposed to give verse 35. Salakia. Let me see if I can get that real quick. This is 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 35. And it reads in the New International Version, I am saying this for your own good, not to restrict you, but that you may live in a right way and undivided devotion to the Lord. So again, this is what I was referencing throughout the whole video. There were those that were called, married, or not. Those that were called, they already knew the law, and they were supposed to be built up the right way. Those that were practicing Jews, those that were Israelite foreigners, they were called into the fold to keep their former covenants and customs. They had to be built up the right way before circumcising themselves and immediately keeping the law to a T. And there were those who had wives that did not believe, and wives that had husbands that did not believe, but they were still to remain with them. Every person, individual wherein they were called was to remain in their office and in their calling, in their respective calling. So this is why Paul says in verse 34 the difference between a wife and a virgin, because you had wives that had already had relations with their husbands and already had households and children, and you had virgins that were, and virgin, the term virgin is just someone who was, like it says, like we would say in today's terminology, engaged to a husband. So Paul is just saying here in verse 30, 35 and on down, that he's saying these things, and he's saying this out of his own commentary, out of his opinion, and pertaining to what was profitable during this time, that so that they may do the work of the ministry and be built up, whether they were practicing Jews or Israelite foreigners coming back into the fold. This was so they could dedicate their time to being built up in a correct manner, because the time was short and there was a destruction coming upon the land. So some of these things you can take and apply today, but some things were actual instructions for that time. Now, Salakia. Let's go down to verse 36. And it reads in the New Living Translation, but if a man think that he's treating his fiancée improperly and will inevitably give in to his passion, let him marry her as he wishes. It is not a sin. Verse 37, but if he has decided firmly not to marry and there is no urgency, he can control his passion, he does well not to marry. Now, here that terminology is to have, to have sexual relations. So if that individual has decided firmly not to have sexual relations and with the person that he was espoused to during this time, because like I read in the previous verses, Paul is saying the time is short, and there was a lot of work to be done during this time. And it says, and there is no urgency, and he can control his passion. He does well not to marry, meaning he does well not to have sexual relations with that virgin that he's espoused to or engaged to. Now, verse 38. So the person who we'll read in the New Living Translation. So the person who marries his fiancée does well, and the person who doesn't marry does even better. So the person who has these sexual relation with his virgin does well, because he is building the household and building up his family in keeping law, statutes, and commandments, and believing in Yahushua and Mashiach during this time. And it says, and the person who doesn't marry does even better, because that way the husband, and before having sexual relations with his wife, with his fiance, they would be built up in a better manner. Instead of having sexual relations with his fiance and then immediately having children, and then, not being built up in the correct way in the faith. So this is the whole point of what Paul is saying. And if you're just reading it and think that everything is applies to today in this chapter and is literal, then you're going to lose yourself, and even in other parts of the epistles. Verse 39 in the New Living Translation. A wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives. If her husband dies, she is free to marry anyone she wishes, but only if he loves the Lord. And it says in the let's go back to the King James Version, and it says, the wife is bound by the law as long as her husband liveth, but if her husband be dead, she is at liberty to be married to whom she will, only in the Lord. So what does that mean, only in the Lord? Well, let's go back to verse 10. And unto the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord. Now that is a reference to the law. And when you reference the law, that is, and it says, let not the wife depart from her husband. And Paul is referencing the law. Paul is referencing what pertains to whom the law was given to, which are the Israelites. This is how you know it's not talking about those of other nations in verse 10 and on down. This is why you have to study and meditate constantly in the scriptures, and constantly go over the precepts, not just the law, but use the law as a measuring stick, and the prophets, and so you can get the proper understanding, especially in the epistles. And you got to separate what is doctrine and which is the things that Paul expounds on pertaining to the doctrine, which is the things contained in the law. And there are things that Paul is speaking as pertaining to actual things that were going on in these various congregations, and you have to separate what he's given as far as his opinion. There's times he gives his opinion. There's times he's using exaggerations, like we read in chapter 5 and verse Salakias, chapter 6 and verse 2 and on down. So you have to separate these different things, and you can watch the previous video for that edification. But that's the whole point when he says in verse 39, only in the Lord. And those that were keeping the laws, statutes, and commandments during this time of the nation of Israel. This is not talking about those of the other nations. This is not talking about everybody. Verse 40, but she is happier if she so abide after my judgment, and I think also that I have the Spirit of God. So this is Paul is saying after my judgment, because he is explaining that the things that he's saying are pertaining to things that were actually going on during this time. So you can't take every single line and think that Paul is speaking the end all be all, because that's not what's going on. Sometimes he's speaking his opinion, like he said in this verse, and then in the previous verse, he's speaking to things pertaining to the law, which is pertaining to doctrine. But not everything Paul says is doctrine. Like we read in verse 18, some things are just hyperboles, which is he's exaggerations or things that sound extravagant, but it's just to make a point. So addressing verse 39, let's go to the book of Deuteronomy, or actually first let's go to let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 24 and verse 1. This book of Deuteronomy chapter 24 and verse 1, and it reads, when a man had taken a wife and married her, and it come to pass that she find no favor in his eyes, because he had found some uncleanliness in her, then let him write her a bill of divorcement, and give it in her hand, and send her out of his house. And it reads verse 2, and when she is departed out of his house, she may go and be another man's wife. Verse 3, and if the latter husband hate her, and write her a bill of divorcement, and give it in her hand, and send her out of his house, or if the latter husband die, which took her to be his wife, her former husband which sent her away may not take her again to be his wife. After that she is defiled, for that is abomination before Yahweh, and thou shalt not cause the land to sin, which the Lord thy God giveth thee for an inheritance. So the point here is that the first man gave her wife a bill of divorce. She went and married another man, and the man wrote her a bill of divorce and sent her out. So if this latter husband, after he sends her out, she can't go back to her first husband and marry him and be back together with him, because that is adultery, because she belongs to the husband that she left. And if she was given that bill of divorcement, she was to remain a widow. Or if her husband died, she was to remain a widow, meaning she couldn't go back to that first husband, whether her second husband divorced her or whether he died. She couldn't go back to that former husband, because that is an abomination. Now, and that's whoredom. Let's go to this is why Paul said, 1 Corinthians 7:39, the wife is bound by the law as long as her husband liveth. For his husband be dead, she is at liberty to be married to whom she will, only in the Lord. Because in this instance, in the latter husband, when he died, she was able to get married, but not to the first husband, but to another Israelite, but not the first husband, because that is contrary to the law. Now let's go to the book of Mark chapter 10 and verse 5. And it reads, And Yahushua answered and said unto them, For the hardness of your heart he wrote unto you. Let's start at verse 2. It's book of Mark chapter 10 and verse 2. And it reads, And the Pharisees came unto him and asked him, Is it lawful for a man to put away his wife, tempting him? Verse 3, And he answered and said unto them, What did Moses command you? And they said, Moses suffered to write a bill of divorcement and to put her away. Verse 5, And Yahushua answered and said unto them, For the hardness of your heart he wrote you this precept. But from the beginning of the creation, the Most High made them male and female. For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh. So then they are no more twain, but one flesh. Verse 9, What therefore God had joined together, let no man put asunder. So the point is, Yahushua was bringing back the basics, because the precepts that law wrote, that Moses wrote in the law, was to get those Israelites that were coming out of Egypt, out of these heathenish practices. And ultimately that was commanded through the Heavenly Father. But Yahushua, more or less, he trumped that law and perfected it, because he was, according to Deuteronomy 18, that prophet that the nation was to listen to, because he would speak the words of Yahweh Hashem Yahushua, of the Most High Yahweh. And this is why Yahushua said from the beginning of creation it was not so. And what God had joined together, let no man separate. So that was written for the Israelites during the time when in the law you could divorce your wife, but Yahushua said, this is why it's important to know the things that Yahushua Mashiach taught, and the things in the epistles, and use a measuring stick, which is Yahushua Mashiach, the things that he taught during his ministry, and the law and the prophets. Because according to what Yahushua Mashiach taught, Deuteronomy 24 and verse 1 and on down, really you're not to be separated from your wife or husband, or the wife to her husband, because what the Most High had joined together, you're not supposed to separate unless for fornication, for the reason of fornication. Like let's bring out book of Matthew chapter 19 and verse 8. Book of Matthew chapter 19 and verse 8. He saith unto them, Ursulakia. Let's go to verse 3. The Pharisees also came unto him, tempting him, and saying unto him, Is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for every cause? And he answered and said unto them, Have ye not read that he which made them at the beginning made them male and female? And he said, For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, and shall cleave to his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh. Verse 6, Wherefore they are no more twain, but one flesh. What therefore God had joined together, let not man put asunder. Verse 7, They say unto him, Why did Moses then command to give a writing of divorcement, and to put her away? Verse 8, He saith unto them, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, suffered you to put away your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. Verse 9, And I say unto you, whosoever shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication, and they shall marry another, committeth adultery. Whoso marrieth her which is put away doth commit adultery. So again, that's going to what the law states. And Yahweh perfected that law, because Moses is saying you can't just put away your wife for no reason. And he's explaining why Moses wrote that. And he's also explaining in the beginning that was not the case. But Moses wrote that because coming out of the land of Egypt, the Israelites were still getting, through the law, when the law was instituted, they were getting weaned off the practices that they had learned in Egypt through these other nations. And it says in verse 9, whosoever shall put away his wife except for fornication and shall marry another committeth adultery. So you're still not able to take away if you were divorced from your first husband and then your second husband put you away or he died, you were not able to return to your former husband. So that's the whole point. So verse 10, his disciples say unto him, if the case of the man be so with his wife, it is not good to marry. But he said unto them, all men cannot receive the saying, save they to whom it is given. Verse 12, for there are some eunuchs which are so born from their mother's womb, and there are some eunuchs which are made eunuchs of men, and there be eunuchs which have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He that is able to receive it, let him receive it. Because ultimately, there were some that will be called, and in ministering, some that will be called in making exhortation videos, some will be called in teaching, some will be called in various offices like Paul states. And this is also what Yahushua Mashiach is saying. And this is why he said all men cannot receive the saying, and the disciples were correct. It's not good to marry, that's the case. Meaning, it's not, the whole purpose is to choose wisely, or not choose a law, or not choose at all, Salakia. But all things are profitable, but all things are not expedient, and you just have to abide wherein you're called. Like Paul said, and even Yahushua Mashiach taught. This is why Paul is not bringing out anything new. He's not creating new doctrine, but he is merely going off the measuring stick, the law and the prophets, and you have the things that Yahushua Mashiach taught. But I think that's it for chapter 7. 1 Corinthians chapter 7 breakdown. It's Brother Yatazadak, hero Israel. Giving all honor and glory to Yahweh Ba'ashim Yahushai. Shalom, Kwam Yasharallah. And until next time.